The city roared to life beneath a canopy of slate-gray clouds, its heartbeat measured in the staccato rhythm of honking horns and hurried footsteps. Rain slicked the streets, turning the morning commute into a chaotic dance of umbrellas and wet shoes. The bus stop on Alder Street was no exception, crowded with passengers jostling for position under the narrow shelter. Amid the clamor, Maya stood apart, her presence understated but commanding. Her caramel-toned skin glistened in the drizzle, and her thick coils of hair framed a face that was both youthful and resolute. Clad in a second-hand coat that had seen better days, she clutched her bag tightly, her fingers numb from the cold. She was tired, bone-tired, but there was no room for rest in her world. Between balancing college classes and working late shifts at the diner, this bus ride was the only reprieve she could afford. When the bus finally screeched to a halt, the passengers surged forward like a tidal wave. Maya let out a sigh of relief as she climbed aboard, the warmth of the interior fogging up her glasses. Her eyes scanned the rows for an empty seat, her body yearning for a moment of respite. And then she saw it, a single spot near the middle, next to a woman who seemed to radiate an air of unspoken authority. Dressed in a pristine beige trench coat and pearl earrings, the woman exuded wealth and confidence. Her silver hair was styled immaculately, her lips painted a bold red. She held her handbag close, the kind that probably cost more than Maya's entire semester of tuition. Maya approached cautiously, her steps tentative but determined. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Is this seat taken?" The woman's head snapped up, her icy blue eyes locking on Maya like a predator sizing up its prey. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches too long and makes everyone around uncomfortable. Slowly, deliberately, the woman slid her handbag onto the empty seat, claiming it as her own. "Yes, it is," she said, her tone clipped and dismissive. Maya froze, disbelief flashing across her face. A murmur rippled through the other passengers, but no one intervened. She looked around, hoping for a shred of support, but all she found were averted gazes and the quiet complicity of indifference. "Ma'am, there's no one else here," Maya tried again, her voice trembling slightly. "I just need a place to sit." The woman's lips curled into a disdainful sneer. "Find another," she said, her words laced with venom. "This one's not for you." Maya's hands trembled as the bus rumbled forward, the faint scent of mildew mingling with the pungent aroma of rain-soaked coats. She clung to the overhead rail, her knuckles pale against her brown skin. Her mind raced, replaying the confrontation in painful detail. "Find another," the woman's cold voice echoed in her thoughts. Maya had experienced moments like this before, microaggressions dressed as politeness, the dismissive glances, the outright hostility. But today, the sting felt deeper. Perhaps it was the exhaustion from her double shift, or maybe it was the aching reminder that, no matter how hard she worked or how polite she was, the world seemed determined to put her in her place. The rain outside battered the windows, each droplet of percussion beat against the bus's metal frame. Maya leaned her head against the cool glass, willing herself to focus on something, anything, other than the knot in her chest. The woman in the beige coat. Across the aisle, the woman adjusted her handbag, her lips curling into a faint smirk. Eleanor Marshall was her name, though she never introduced herself to anyone she deemed beneath her. Born into privilege, Eleanor had grown up in a world of tailored suits and exclusive clubs. Her father, a prominent banker, had instilled in her an unshakable belief in the social hierarchy. "It's not just money," her father had once told her, swirling a glass of brandy in their sprawling estate. "It's breeding. People like us are the backbone of this country. Everyone else is just noise." Eleanor carried that lesson with her like gospel, her worldview shaped by a lifetime of entitlement. To her, the bus was a necessary inconvenience, a temporary punishment for her car being in the shop. She loathed sharing space with common people, much less someone like Maya. As the bus jolted over a pothole, Eleanor clutched her armrest, her expression souring. She glanced at the passengers around her, a man in a construction uniform, a young mother struggling to quiet her toddler, an elderly couple whispering softly to each other. Her gaze landed briefly on Maya, who stood at the back, her face half hidden by the hood of her coat. Eleanor's lips thinned. She didn't regret her actions. She believed she was right. Yet, somewhere deep within her, a flicker of discomfort stirred. Up front, the driver kept his eyes on the road, though he had seen everything. Martin Chambers was a man of few words, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He had been driving buses in the city for over 20 years, witnessing countless stories unfold in the rows behind him. He'd seen the kindness of strangers, a young man giving up his seat for an elderly passenger, a teenager helping a mother lift her stroller aboard. But he had also seen the ugliness, arguments that escalated into fistfights, stolen wallets, and like today, the quiet cruelty of prejudice. Martin didn't intervene this time. He rarely did, not because he didn't care, but because experience had taught him the limits of his influence. Still, as he glanced at Maya through the rearview mirror, a pang of guilt gnawed at him. He resolved to keep an eye on the situation, just in case. The bus turned onto a quieter street, the hum of the engine drowning out the sound of rain. Maya shifted her weight, her feet aching from hours of standing. She stared at the back of Eleanor's head, her mind grappling with whether to say something. But before she could decide, the bus jerked violently, sending passengers lurching forward. A loud bang echoed from the rear, followed by a metallic groan. The bus slowed to a stop, its engine sputtering before falling silent. "What now?" Eleanor muttered, her voice tinged with annoyance. She glanced at her watch, tapping it impatiently. The driver stood and turned to face the passengers. "Sorry, folks. Looks like we got a flat tire. I'll call for a replacement bus, but it might take a while. You're welcome to wait here or find alternate transportation." A collective groan rippled through the crowd. Some passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to brave the rain, while others stayed put, resigned to the delay. Maya remained where she was, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She noticed the elderly couple whispering again, their expressions uneasy. The young mother tried to soothe her crying child, her movements frantic and weary. And then there was Eleanor, her lips pursed in irritation as she rummaged through her bag. "Unbelievable," Eleanor muttered under her breath. "Why does this kind of thing always happen to me?" But karma, as they say, has a way of leveling the playing field. Just as the passengers were settling into their frustration, the bus door hissed open, and a figure stepped inside. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding immediate attention. Clad in a dark raincoat, he carried an air of quiet authority that silenced the murmurs. "Everyone stay calm," he said, his voice deep and measured. "We've got a situation." The tension in the air shifted, the mundane irritation replaced by a prickling sense of unease. Maya's pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The man's eyes swept over the passengers, lingering briefly on Eleanor before moving on. "Please don't panic," he continued. "I just need some cooperation." And with that, he reached into his coat, pulling out something that made everyone freeze: a gun. The glint of the gun under the harsh fluorescent lights sent a collective gasp rippling through the bus. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye turned toward the man now standing at the front of the aisle. Rain dripped from the hem of his coat, pooling around his boots as he surveyed the passengers like a predator sizing up his prey. Maya's heart thundered in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins making it hard to think. She instinctively gripped the pole next to her, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. "All right," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Everybody listen up, and no one gets hurt." He gestured with the gun, the motion deliberate but calm. This wasn't the erratic behavior of someone unhinged. This was someone with a plan. "I don't want your wallets or your phones," he continued, pacing slowly down the aisle. "I'm not here to rob you. I just need your attention." His words hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken implications. The passengers exchanged wary glances, their fear palpable. Maya noticed the young mother clutching her child tightly, whispering soothing words into his ear. The elderly couple sat frozen, their hands intertwined. But it was Eleanor who caught Maya's attention. The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line, her knuckles white as she clutched her handbag. The arrogance that had radiated from her earlier was gone, replaced by a veneer of brittle composure. For a moment, Maya felt a pang of schadenfreude. So much for being untouchable, she thought. But the feeling was fleeting. Whatever this man wanted, they were all in danger, and their differences no longer mattered. The man stopped in the middle of the aisle, his dark eyes scanning the faces before him. He looked to be in his late 30s, his features rugged and sharp. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, partially hidden by the shadow of his hood. "My name doesn't matter," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the rain. "What matters is that people like you, people who think they can go about their lives ignoring the struggles of others, need to understand something." He pointed the gun at the ceiling and fired a single shot. The deafening crack made everyone flinch, and Maya felt her knees buckle. A woman in the front row let out a muffled sob, while the rest of the passengers sat paralyzed with fear. "Now that I have your attention," the man said, his tone eerily calm, "let's talk about what happens next." At the back of the bus, Maya's mind raced. She wasn't sure what this man's motive was, but one thing was clear. Waiting for someone else to act wasn't an option. Her father had always told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She glanced at the passengers around her, their fear mirrored in her own chest. The young mother, the elderly couple, even Eleanor, they were all depending on someone to step up. Maya thinks she told herself, there has to be a way to de-escalate this. Her eyes darted around the bus, taking in every detail. The emergency exit at the back, the driver's radio near the front, the small fire extinguisher tucked beneath one of the seats. None of it seemed helpful. Then she remembered her phone. She had slipped it into her coat pocket before boarding. If she could discreetly text for help or record what was happening, it might make a difference. She slowly slid her hand into her pocket, her movements deliberate and careful. Meanwhile, Eleanor's composure was beginning to crack. The sharp smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, and the reality of her situation was sinking in. She was used to being in control, but now her wealth and status meant nothing. Her mind churned with 1,000 thoughts. What if he shoots me? What if he takes my bag? She clutched her handbag tighter, as though it could shield her from the unfolding nightmare. The man's gaze shifted to her, and Eleanor felt her blood run cold. "You," he said, pointing the gun in her direction. "You look like someone who's had an easy life." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her throat felt dry, and her vision blurred as tears welled up. "People like you," the man continued, his voice dripping with contempt, "walk through this world with blinders on, ignoring the pain and suffering around you. You think your money makes you untouchable. Well, guess what? It doesn't." Maya watched the exchange, her stomach twisting. She could see the terror in Eleanor's eyes, the facade of superiority crumbling like a house of cards. She doesn't deserve this, Maya thought, surprising herself. She had every reason to let the woman fend for herself, to let karma take its course. But Maya knew better than most that cruelty didn't justify cruelty. A plan in motion. Maya's hand finally found her phone. She kept it hidden in her coat pocket as she unlocked it by feel. Her fingers trembled as she typed out a message. "Help! Bus hijacked. Alder Street. Armed man." She hit send, praying that the signal would go through. The man's voice snapped her back to the present. "Let's start with you," he said, gesturing toward Eleanor. "Stand up?" Eleanor hesitated, her hands shaking. "I said stand up," he barked. Maya couldn't take it anymore. Before she could stop herself, she spoke. "Leave her alone," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The man turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "And who are you?" "Maya," she said, stepping forward. Her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to move. "If you're trying to make a point, picking on her isn't going to help. Let her sit down." The man tilted his head, studying her. For a moment, the bus was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, he lowered the gun slightly. "You've got guts," he said, "but guts won't save you." Maya held his gaze, her heart pounding. Maybe not, but if you want someone to listen, I'll listen. Just leave everyone else out of it. The man's expression softened, just enough for Maya to catch a glimpse of something human beneath the hardened exterior. Fine, he said. Let's talk. The rain intensified outside, hammering against the windows of the stranded bus. But the storm inside was far more volatile. Maya stood at the center of the aisle, her legs barely supporting her weight as adrenaline coursed through her body. Her eyes never left the man in the raincoat, his fingers still resting on the trigger of the gun. The other passengers sat frozen in their seats, their breath shallow and eyes wide. The young mother clutched her toddler tightly, rocking him gently as if to shield him from the unfolding horror. The elderly couple held hands, whispering prayers under their breath. And then there was Eleanor trembling in her seat, her once pristine beige coat now damp with sweat. Maya took another step forward, her shoes squeaking against the wet floor. She forced herself to speak, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "You said you wanted someone to listen," she said, keeping her hands visible. "I'm listening, but this isn't the way to make your point." The man's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "And what would you know about it?" he asked, his tone mocking. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be invisible? To scream at the world for years and have no one care?" Maya hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't know this man's story, but she knew pain, intimately. She knew what it felt like to work twice as hard for half as much, to be overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. "I know what it's like to feel powerless," she said, her voice softer now. "But I also know that hurting people won't fix it." The man's grip on the gun faltered, just for a moment. Maya saw it, the crack in his armor. But before she could press further, Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Don't listen to her," Eleanor snapped, her fear twisting into anger. "She doesn't speak for us." The passengers turned to her in shock. Maya flinched, the words hitting her like a slap. But she quickly realized that Eleanor's outburst wasn't just fear. It was desperation, a last-ditch effort to reclaim control. The man's eyes darkened, his focus shifting back to Eleanor. "You," he said coldly. "Stand up. Now." Eleanor froze, her face paling. She clutched her handbag tighter, her knuckles turning white. I can't," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Please, just leave me alone." The man raised the gun, his patience wearing thin. "I wasn't asking." Maya's heart raced as she saw Eleanor's composure shatter. The once arrogant woman was now a quivering shell, her fear raw and unfiltered. And yet, Maya couldn't let herself feel satisfaction. "Wait," Maya said, stepping between them. "You don't need to do this." The man's jaw tightened. "Why do you keep defending her? She wouldn't do the same for you." Maya swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She knew he was right. Eleanor had shown nothing but disdain for her. But this wasn't about Eleanor. It was about choosing to be better, even when the world wasn't. "Because it's not about her," Maya said. "It's about me, and you, and everyone here. None of us deserve this." The man's eyes flickered with something Maya couldn't quite place. Anger, sorrow, regret. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the hardened mask he wore so well. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain. The man lowered the gun slightly, his shoulders sagging as if under an invisible weight. "You think you understand me?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know the first thing about what I've been through?" "Then tell me," Maya said gently. "Help me understand." For a moment, the man seemed to consider her words. His grip on the gun loosened as he stared at the floor, lost in thought. "My name is Daniel," he began, his voice distant. "I used to have a family, a wife, a daughter. We weren't rich, but we were happy." The passengers listened in stunned silence, the tension shifting as Daniel's story unfolded. "Then one day, my daughter got sick, really sick, the kind of sick that drains your bank account and leaves you begging strangers for help." His voice cracked, and he took a shaky breath. "I went to everyone, friends, family, even people like her." He gestured toward Eleanor with a bitter sneer. "No one cared. They looked right through me like I didn't exist." Daniel's eyes glistened, but he quickly wiped them, his anger flaring again. "She died. She died because no one would help us." And now, I'm supposed to sit back and watch people like her live their perfect little lives, pretending nothing's wrong. The bus was silent, the weight of his words suffocating. Maya's chest ached as she imagined the pain he must have carried, the grief that had festered into something dark and destructive. "I'm sorry," Maya said softly. "I can't imagine what you've been through. But this isn't what your daughter would have wanted. She wouldn't want you to hurt people." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Maya thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Before Daniel could respond, the distant wail of sirens pierced the air. Someone had called for help. Panic flashed across his face as he realized his time was running out. "I didn't want this," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Maya took a cautious step closer. "It's not too late to stop," she said. "Put the gun down, Daniel. Let's figure this out together." Daniel's hand trembled as he looked between her and the approaching lights outside. The weight of his choices hung heavy in the air. Finally, with a shaky breath, he lowered the gun and placed it on the floor. The bus erupted into a collective sigh of relief. Tears streamed down Maya's face as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As the police escorted Daniel off the bus, Eleanor sat in stunned silence, her face pale and drawn. She looked at Maya, her expression a mixture of guilt and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Maya nodded, but she didn't respond. She didn't need Eleanor's thanks. What mattered was that everyone was safe, and Daniel had a chance to find redemption. Conclusion: strength and compassion. The bus ride ended, but the impact of that day lingered long after. Maya walked away knowing she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone on that bus, including Eleanor. And Eleanor? For the first time in her life, she began to question the walls she had built around herself. She started small, offering a kind word to strangers, donating to those in need. Slowly but surely, she began to change. As for Maya, she carried the memory of that day as a reminder that courage and compassion have the power to transform even the darkest moments.